welcome to Channel's Business Global with me, Juliana Olayinka, from our studios here in London. Over the next half an hour, we'll be looking beyond the business headlines by giving you in-depth perspective on the stories that are affecting all of us. Coming up on today's show, Bola Ahmed Tinubu has been declared winner of Nigeria's fiercely contested presidential election. The two-time governor of Lagos State now faces a population that is deeply divided and widely disengaged. In per capita terms, Nigeria's economy has shrunk by about 30% since 2014, and millions of its citizens are living in poverty. The incoming administration must now decide how to carve out an inclusive way forward. Paul Arkwright, the former British High Commissioner to Nigeria, will be joining me shortly to examine the socio-economic and geopolitical perspective of the result. And after 4 months of intense negotiations, the EU and UK have a deal to resolve their long-running post-Brexit trade row over Northern Ireland. As lawmakers from both sides of the Irish Sea comb through the details, our business correspondent Simon Pusey will be joining me here in the studio for a deep dive into the reactions. Then later we'll be looking back at some of the biggest business news stories of the week. But first, let's start the show with a topic that has provoked a significant number of headlines, both here in Nigeria and, of course, across the entire world. In the early hours of Wednesday morning, the Independent National Electoral Commission announced Bola Ahmed Tinubu as president-elect of Nigeria after securing 37% of the vote. Turnout at just a quarter of registered voters was low and means the president-elect inherits a youthful population who are frustrated and deeply divided. The result of the election has been disputed by opposition parties, and international observers from the US and the European Union have also flagged significant issues with the process. UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak was one of the first world leaders to congratulate Tinubu publicly, and amidst a slew of international reactions, some observers remain hopeful that this new administration can usher in the much-needed change that Nigerians deserve. The Wall Street Journal writes Mr. Tinubu would likely take a more active role coordinating and communicating government actions, including helping to manage conflict in Nigeria's north. In the DW, there are Nigerians who would prefer someone younger, but the experience Tinubu brings to the job will likely help him do it well. The business of governance is a complex one which requires teamwork. Tinubu has a long track record of forming result-oriented teams which deliver, although it's wise to remain cautiously optimistic. And then this in Forbes. With the announcement today of Mr. Bola Ahmed Tinubu as president-elect by the Independent National Electoral Commission, or INEC, the incoming administration must now decide whether they go down in history as the administration that noticed the economic shift towards a global apolitical money and used that opportunity to leverage more fair access to international rails than foreign financial service providers have ever offered. The author goes on to say 2023 could be brighter and more full of opportunity than ever. I remain bullish on Nigeria. Well, let's see if our next guest is as bullish as Forbes. Paul Arkwright is the former British High Commissioner to Nigeria. He joins me virtually from here in the British capital. Paul Arkwright, thank you so much for joining me on the programme. I've just run through, for the sake of the audience, some of the global headlines, the international headlines. Of course, nobody's avoiding the elephant in the room, which is the fact that opposition parties dispute the result. However, I think some would say it's, pretty much night and day between Muhammadu Buhari and Bola Ahmed Tinubu in terms of what Nigeria's economic prospects could be. So if you kind of scroll down in these articles, there is a little bit of optimism and some bullish sentiment. But I would like to have your thoughts on the entire process from Saturday, 25th of February until, INEC handed over the certificate of return.
Well, thank you, Juliana. It's good to be back on the programme. So the process was flawed. I think, we all have to accept that. There were problems around logistics, around the opening of polling units, big problems, I think, around the transmission, the electronic transmission of votes from the polling units to the collation centre, and some gaps in that period, which I think were cause for concern. We saw incidents of violence. I have to say, I think there were isolated incidents of violence, but obviously that's not a good thing. And so, of course, the opposition are crying foul. They have, I know the Labour Party has launched a legal challenge. So we'll see what happens. Against that, this campaign, and if you look back to the period before Saturday, this campaign has definitely energized young people. I think it's brought a new engagement and commitment to the political process. We've seen a third-party candidate doing extremely well in the circumstances, challenging the stranglehold of the two major parties. And that in itself is, I think, a positive step for democracy. So it's a mixed picture. As you say, Bola Ahmed Tinubu has been declared the winner. There have been international reactions. I know that the British Prime Minister has congratulated him on that victory. Let's hope that he is magnanimous, that he reaches out to those who didn't vote for him, as he said he would in his acceptance speech. And yes, I remain optimistic for Nigeria. Let's turn the page. Let's focus on what he will do to tackle some of those really big challenges. I wish him well, and I'm very happy to be a part of that effort.
Yeah, I echo that optimism sentiment. That's really important. And also urging people to remain peaceful, which is absolutely fundamental. You know, whatever side of the coin you're on, Nigeria's political map has been completely redrawn. What can we take from Peter Obi's success? Overall, you know, he did so much better than I think anybody could have imagined, but particularly in Lagos and Abuja. What does this mean for Tinubu's tenure?
Well, let's not forget there are some more elections to come.
Yeah.
The governorship elections on the 11th of March are going to be very important. As we all know, governors are very powerful, important politicians, statespeople in Nigeria. I'm sure the APC will be doing everything in their power to ensure that they retain the governorship of Lagos State, and that's certainly one to watch. But I think it's good for democracy that a third party and a third candidate has indeed, as you say, done so well. And like you and many people, I was surprised at his success in certain areas. Lagos was a case in point, and others as well. So I think that's healthy. I think he ran a good campaign. I agree the political map has been redrawn in that sense. Let's see what happens on the 11th of March. It wouldn't surprise me at all if Labour got some governorships, especially obviously in Peter Obi's home territory in the southeast. And as you said, and this is very important, peaceful elections on the 11th of March are absolutely critical.
Yeah, they are.
So let's hope that works, and that INEC learn their lessons from the mistakes that have been made in the presidential elections and apply those on the 11th.
Absolutely. Within his victory speech, President-elect Bola Ahmed Tinubu claimed to have a serious mandate. I was telling you about the international headlines that I've been reading this week, and you know, some are optimistic. You know, they want to do business with Nigeria, and they believe that Tinubu is a man, whether you like him or not, you can do business with. What do you think should be his priorities? I don't know if the 100 days thing works in Nigeria, but clearly people are going to be watching, you know, what his first moves are likely to be.
Yes, 100 days is a traditional thing. I remember the Buhari-ometer in 2015, which looked at the first 100 days as well. So starting quickly, I think sending some signals in a number of key areas where the challenges are really very worrying. Security is one, so tackling insecurity, not just in the northeast with Boko Haram and Iswa, but across the country where, in general, security has been has got a lot worse over the past 8 years. The economy, yes, that's critical. It's also linked to security, of course, creating an economy where young people can get jobs, good jobs where they are fulfilled and don't see the need to resort to violence or criminal activity. And a few signals that I will be looking for and that my clients as investors in Nigeria will be looking for. I think the FX exchange rate policy of the current central bank has been disastrous. I want to see a rapid change in that, and I know that the international community is looking at that, aligning the parallel and the bank rates. There's been a lot of talk of removing the fuel subsidy. I think doing that quickly, even though it may have short-term pain, will be very important. And of course, bringing monetary policy to bear in driving down inflation. And again, the critical role of the central bank is all going to be part of that picture. But investors are looking for those kind of signals. And I think if we see a rapid improvement, then we will see investment flowing back to Nigeria, and that can only be a good thing.
It can only be a good thing. And of course, the difficult task of unifying the country. Let's see how it goes. And we wish him all the best, of course. Paul Arkwright, former British High Commissioner to Nigeria, also business strategist at Arkwright Consultancy. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much.
So please permit me to move away from Nigerian politics for now to focus on news emanating from here in the United Kingdom. After 4 months of intense talks, the EU and the UK have a deal to resolve their long-running post-Brexit trade row over Northern Ireland. In short, Westminster will take back control of tax and subsidy rates in Northern Ireland, and there will be fewer checks on goods going from the mainland. The announcement of the deal will also raise questions about the future of British politics. Well, for more on this, I was earlier joined in the studio by our business correspondent, Simon Pusey. Simon, forgive me, I haven't been following this Brexit news as closely as I should have because Nigeria's future has been at stake over the past few days. Whilst we've been redrawing our political map, it does appear as if the British political map and its relationship with the EU has also been redrawn. Lots of optimism about this new Brexit deal. But among the Eurosceptics and the kind of hard Brexiteers in the Conservative Party, major concerns. Talk to us about it.
Yeah, well, it's being lauded as a massive win, which we don't get, we don't hear often from the Conservative Party, especially not when it comes to Brexit, and especially when, you know, you've got the EU also saying this is a good deal. That never has really happened, certainly not in the days of Boris Johnson. But Rishi Sunak seems to have done, most people seem to think in his party that he's done a very good job here. Let's just remind ourselves what the situation is. So trade between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland used to be very easy before Brexit. Both were in the EU, so they had the same rules. However, when Northern Ireland left the EU with the rest of the United Kingdom, a deal was required to prevent checks being introduced. The EU has strict food rules and different checks and balances. The new deal is aimed at significantly reducing those number of checks. So there's going to be 2 lanes, a green lane and a red lane, and the green lane means that various items will be able to pass through without any checks. So it's just taking away a lot of paperwork and a lot of administration.
And these are Irish Sea checks, aren't they?
Exactly, a lot of administration that that businesses were really struggling with. It's been hailed as a huge victory by Rishi Sunak, of course. He says that Northern Ireland is now in an unbelievably special position because it gives the nation access to both the UK and the European Union markets, making it the world's most exciting economic zone, his words. Critics, of course, pointing out that that is exactly where we were before we left the EU. So before 2016, we had these rules. We could do what we wanted. And people highlighting how much of a mess we must be in if the fact that we can move goods around our own country is being hailed as a huge success. So people saying, you know, this is the least we should be doing. We shouldn't be crowing about this from the rooftops. As you say, a couple of hardline Brexiteers saying it should have gone further, and a couple of people in Northern Ireland, members of the DUP, saying it doesn't go far enough. But I think this is a rare win for the government in terms of you've got Ursula von der Leyen saying, "Dear Rishi," and it looks like that sort of relationship between the
Lots
EU,
of pleasantries during her
seems
visit.
to have been patched up a little bit after, you know, Liz Truss and Boris Johnson didn't do such a good job there. So I think this does seem to be quite a good bit of statesmanship from Rishi Sunak, and you can't really think of any better thing in terms of a couple of months ago. This was so far away, this kind of agreement, and it is going to go through Parliament, of course, because Conservatives at the moment have such a big majority. So I think all plain sailing there, and I think people are quite impressed with Rishi Sunak for getting that done. A lot of things still remain, of course, and there will be many troubles ahead, but it is a rare piece of good news for the Conservatives with an election not too far away. It seems like that's been pulled off pretty well, and I'm sure Rishi Sunak had a huge team behind him, but it looks good for him.
Yes, let's hope it's going to be good for the businesses who've been caught up in this bureaucracy. Thank you so much, Simon.
Thank you.
Welcome back to Channel's Business Global with me, Juliana Olayinka, from our studios here in London. In a moment, I'll be discussing some of the reasons why the British government is actively considering vaccinating the country's poultry flock with Peter Stevenson, the Chief Policy Advisor at Compassion in World Farming. But until then, here's Teniola Oyetayo with a breakdown of the biggest business news stories of the week.
Building materials giant CRH is planning to move its main share listing from the UK to the US in a further blow to the London Stock Exchange. The Ireland-based firm said North America now accounted for about 3/4 of its earnings and was likely to be a key driver of future growth. The move is likely to add to concerns that the UK stock market is losing out to overseas rivals. Metro Bank posted a narrower annual loss on Thursday and said it's well on its way to being profitable after cutting costs and seeing its finances bolstered by higher interest rates. The London-based company still posted pre-tax losses of £70.7 million over the last year, but it was significantly lower than the £245.1 million reported at the end of 2021. The lender, however, says its net interest margin growth will be limited in 2023 as it expects fewer base rate moves and inflationary pressures to outweigh its cost initiatives. China has accused the US of overreacting after federal employees were ordered to remove the video app TikTok from government-issued phones over data concerns. TikTok has faced allegations that it harvests users' data and hands it to the Chinese government. On Monday, the White House gave government agencies 30 days to ensure that employees did not have the Chinese-owned app on federal devices. The order follows similar moves by the EU and Canada in recent weeks. Teniola Oyetayo for Channel's Business Global.
Thanks, Tenny. Now to our final topic. You may have noticed that it costs a lot more to purchase eggs from supermarkets at the moment, and this is not solely a cause of high inflation. A global pandemic of highly pathogenic avian influenza, a form of bird flu, has resulted in the deaths of over 43 million hens in the British egg industry alone, causing a drop in the supply of eggs and higher prices for consumers. While industry and government officials are feverishly working on getting this outbreak under control, the more significant issue is that confining animals by the billions in cruel and inhumane conditions exacerbates the spread of the disease. Well, for more on this, I'm now being joined by Peter Stevenson, the Chief Policy Advisor at Compassion in World Farming. Peter joins me from North Berwick in Scotland. Peter Stevenson, thank you so much for taking your time out to join me on the show today. I was reading Bloomberg earlier this week, and they're reporting that an unprecedented global flu outbreak has killed off at least 58 million birds, and this is in America alone. How did we get here, and should we be worried?
Globally, it's 140 million. So, yes, we shouldn't panic, but we should be worried. The poultry sector and governments like to blame wild birds for bird flu because that distracts from the role of intensive poultry production in the development of this disease. But the Scientific Task Force on Avian Influenza, which includes the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, says that wild birds are the victims of bird flu. They have not caused it. What happens is that the bird flu virus that naturally occurs in wild birds is usually of low pathogenicity. In other words, it generally causes them very little harm. It's when it gets into intensive poultry sheds that low pathogenic bird flu can evolve into dangerous high pathogenic bird flu. Industrial poultry production, in which thousands of birds are crammed into a shed, gives the virus a constant supply of new hosts. It's able to move very quickly among them, perhaps mutating as it does so. And in this circumstance, highly virulent new strains are likely to rapidly emerge. And indeed, this scientific task force has said that since the mid-2000s, spillover of bird flu from poultry to wild birds has occurred on multiple occasions.
Goodness me. Well, I think, Peter, we're all still traumatised, aren't we, from COVID-19 and the pandemic. Our viewers watching from Britain will remember foot and mouth and also bird flu before. And you talked about the mutation. I do believe there are instances around the world of this flu transmitting to humans. I'd like to have your views on that. But also, a lot of people have got a sniff at the moment. We're all familiar with an ordinary flu virus. How does this strain differ, and is it life-threatening?
It differs because at the moment it is evolving and mutating very, very quickly. There have been, over the last 25 years, about 850 human cases of bird flu, usually with people who are working very closely with birds. But if people do get it, it's a killer. It kills over 50% of the people that get it. What's been troubling in recent weeks and months is that it has now spread away from birds to mammals. It's been found in foxes, otters, seals, sea lions, and really worryingly in a mink farm in Spain. What's been worrying there is that having got into the farm, it's spread amongst the mink. Because so far, with mammals, the feeling has been that it'll get into one mammal but not spread to others. But here we're seeing it spreading. Now, scientists are saying, again, they're not trying to scaremonger, but they said it would only need a few mutations for it possibly to infect people and be able to move from one person to another. So we don't want to panic, but we need to do something about this.
Yes, and that goes quite nicely into my next question, was what should be done to tackle the cause of this devastating disease? And are Compassion in World Farming feeling, pretty despondent and, sad that perhaps most people don't care about diseases such as this if it only affects animals, which is quite cruel, isn't it?
Yes, it is, because the birds too suffer enormously. Dying from bird flu is devastating. It infects the lungs and other internal organs. It leads to severe internal bleeding. That's the ones that die. The ones that are culled, when governments come in and say we're going to just wipe out a whole flock to stop it spreading. Again, the methods of culling cause great suffering, particularly the method used in the US called ventilation shutdown, where simply, you've got thousands of birds in a shed, the automatic ventilation is shut down, the heating is pushed up very, very high, and over about 3 hours, the birds die of suffocation and heat stress. So what should be done? The problem at the moment is governments have no strategy for how to bring this to an end. They hope it'll just die down in time, but there's no sign of that happening. The outbreaks are getting worse, they're longer lasting, more birds are dying and being culled. I believe we need a three-pronged action plan. Firstly, we need to vaccinate poultry. Obviously, we can't vaccinate wild birds, but the domestic poultry and farms. Governments tend to be against vaccination, and it's not without its difficulties, but it can slow down the spread of the disease. The UK government is repeating its mistakes from 20 years ago in foot and mouth, where it was against vaccination, and that led to foot and mouth, the outbreak being much longer than needed, many more animals being killed than was necessary. So we need vaccination. Secondly, we need a big restructuring of the poultry sector. We need to move to farms with smaller numbers of birds and the birds having more space. Once you've got less birds and more space, the likelihood of viruses spreading and amplifying into something worse is much reduced.
Really insightful listening to you. Peter Stevenson, Chief Policy Advisor for Compassion in World Farming. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Well, sadly, that's all we have time for today, but as always, do get in touch with your comments and suggestions. I'll see you at the same time next week for more in-depth business analysis on Channel's Business Global. Goodbye.